Okay, so greetings from Tokyo. This is Daisuke, and I am very, very happy today because I am very honored to be welcoming a great guest. This is Alan Canvan. Alan Canvan is a very important name in the world of Bruce Lee and also in the world of Criterion and recent Criterion releases, as you may know, because there was this recent set by the Criterion Collection earlier this year in 2020, Bruce Lee, His Greatest Hits. And among the films included in this was the film Game of Death. And in respect of the film Game of Death, there was a really fascinating work called Game of Death Redux. And it appears in the set in the Great Supplement section. Game of Death Redux was a work that was made by Alan Canvan. And so we have Mr. Canvan here with us today. So I hope to be able to talk with Alan about that and many other things. So without further ado, welcome, Alan. It's a pleasure.
Thank you so much, Daisuke. As I mentioned to you before, I'm a big fan of your show on YouTube. I try to catch it as much as I can, so it's an honor to be here speaking with you about this.
Oh my goodness, thank you. The honor is all mine. And I'm just really fascinated, and I'm looking forward to asking you questions and hearing your responses about Game of Death Redux and about Bruce Lee in general and about cinema in general. And so I'm looking forward to this very much. I suppose if we can just get things started without further ado, Alan, could you just, for purposes of anyone who might be coming here and meeting you for the first time, could you let us know a little bit about yourself and your background and about maybe how you ended up getting into the world of Bruce Lee cinema? So could you tell us a little bit about that background of yours?
Sure. So it's a bit convoluted, but maybe not so much. I saw my first image of Bruce Lee when I was about 7 years old, and it was through an older cousin who was a big Bruce Lee fan, and he was basically giving me a synopsis of the movie The Big Boss. So he showed me this picture, and I was so captivated between the image that I was seeing and the story that he was telling me, which was a story of the Big Boss. And he was telling it to me in almost in real time, as if this was a story that actually happened. That, again, the Bruce Lee mythology is always so big, especially with fans, that they often speak of, when they're speaking about his exploits in films, it's as if the story really happened. So that kind of is what set me on my course. I spent about 2 years following him through images in magazines before I saw my first film. And my first film was, funnily enough, or maybe not so funnily enough, Game of Death, 1978. But I actually saw it in 1979 because we didn't get it here in the US until 1979. So that pretty much set my course in terms of being interested in Bruce Lee's cinematic work and in him, him as a person for many, many, many years to come. So, it was basically since I was about 7 that I got the bug, and then spent the rest of my years, doing as much research as I could and watching his movies incessantly, until, basically ad infinitum, I should say. So that's basically, was my introduction to Bruce. Kind of parenthetical to that, I've always been a huge lover and fan of cinema in general, specifically with the 70s and 80s cinema being my sweet spot. So, film as an art form has always fascinated me, and by extension of that, film analysis has always interested me as well.
Thank you very much for that. This, could you, before I move on, you
Yeah.
mentioned, of course, 70s and 80s,
Mm-hmm.
and of course other areas of cinema, I can assume. So what were some examples of those works of cinema that really affected you, or that you thought were really
Well,
your,
I
some of
mean,
your favorites?
like many, being a 70s child, 70s, 80s child, of course, going to see Star Wars for the very first time was a life-changing experience. In fact, I think that that's probably the first movie I remember going to see in the cinema. There might have been something before that, but that's the one that stands out. A few years later, Richard Donner's Superman the movie was life-changing. And then as I grew older, I started exploring kind of like the mavericks of 70s cinema, like Scorsese and Coppola's work. Taxi Driver being a huge influence on, how I saw, film in general, and how what it could be, and the parameters within that could kind of be stretched. Um, on top of that, the early 80s had a really good explosion in terms of equally, talented and innovative filmmakers like Jim Cameron with his first Terminator movie. And a lot of the stuff, Paul Verhoeven, who did some phenomenal stuff in the 80s. So it kind of like cinema always kind of captivated me in the sense that, I loved watching films and appreciated them as an art form. But beyond that, I was also very interested in analyzing the films, what the subtext was. What were the director's intentions? What were the writer's intentions? And of course, the performances. So that kind of, film has always been kind of on the periphery for me in terms of my whole entire life. And I spent a good deal of the 90s and 2000s kind of working. I did a short stint at New York Film Academy, and worked in the film, in the film world to varying degrees, for a period of about 15 to 20 years. And then I kind of, just sat back for a while, and Game of Death had always been something that, it was like this gigantic Rubik's Cube in terms of the information that was out there, right? In terms of what we actually got in the 78 film versus the footage that everybody talked about there being and getting glimpses of in documentaries, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there was a specific fascination with Game of Death, beyond it just being my first Bruce Lee film, but also from the perspective of there was a real mystery to it in terms of what was out there.
Thank you very much for that. And so it sounds like you really were discovering films and being affected by films. And it was during this time that you also discovered Bruce Lee, as you say, and then that led up to your first cinematic encounter with Bruce Lee in the aforementioned film Game of Death. So, and you describe it as a Rubik's Cube of a puzzle, which is a fascinating way to describe that work. And and of course, it will touch upon very directly your subsequent work in relation to footage that is, of course, very directly relevant to what ended up becoming Game of Death, the films. And I'm trying to be as specific as possible because I know it's a very complicated matter. But I suppose before we get to Game of Death specifically, I would like to now ask you about Bruce Lee, the world of Bruce Lee, the cinematic legacy of Bruce Lee. You mentioned a little bit about The Big Boss, and then you mentioned about watching Game of Death. So could you now tell us about specific instances, your feelings, how you feel when you watch certain films or certain moments from films? Are there any moments in the Bruce Lee filmography that really speak to you and sing to you, or that you feel are best emblematic or best representative of why you love Bruce Lee so much?
That's a great question. I mean, the short answer is yes. I've watched his movies, countless times over the years. When I still put on a Blu-ray, watching, the Big Boss or Enter the Dragon, or, even Way of the Dragon, I definitely do get that spark that, that I had when I was a kid. I don't think that's ever going to change. But what's interesting to me is that, in studying his work, for so long, I kind of began to see a lot of the connective tissue between his ideas and what actually made it into his films versus what his goals were. Because I believe that there was this particular brand of martial art film that he wanted to do that kind of went back to his very first martial art, or what was going to be his very first martial art project that he was doing with Sterling Silfant and James Coburn. That eventually, it fell through and it was unproduced. But it kind of set the tone in terms of the type of film that I feel that he felt would be his own kind of personal brand of martial art film. To answer your question, yes, there are many moments in his movies that that stand out. It's hard to kind of mention those moments as just being like all encompassing of who Bruce is. But one moment that really comes to mind that I love is the scene in The Big Boss. And this is such a subtle scene, right? When he's walking with his cousin from the gambling den, and they're talking, and the thugs come up behind them. They're a few feet back, and they shout out, and they stop, they pause as they're talking. And his cousin, that's played by James Chen, turns around, but Bruce does a slow burn of a turn. And in that moment, it's not only it wasn't only just a brilliant choice as an actor, but you really see exactly what Bruce is in that moment. He's like a perfect kind of like storm that just builds. It's a little bit of a slow burn, and then when it happens, it's just like, you better watch out. It's a done deal, So, of course, there are many moments of the fight scenes and the fight choreography, which really was his bread and butter. He reinvented cinema with his fight choreography. I don't think that there's anybody that's done action cinema post Bruce Lee that hasn't been inspired in some way by his angles, the way he shot things, the pacing of the scenes themselves. It was all heavily inspired by Bruce to some degree or another. So does that answer your question? Or did I just kind of go off on a tangent there?
That was great. I really love that moment too that you referred to in The Big Boss. And I think especially too when we have to remember that there's a lot of buildup, right? And it has to do obviously with the production background with respect to that film. Yes. In terms of what it was and who was going to be the star and who was going to be the focus. And right. So the moment that you're referring to, yes, you're absolutely right. There is a sense, there's this real buildup was what's going to happen? Is he going to do right. What we now know Bruce Lee, of course, but what was he going to do? And of course, we know that we're going to have to wait a little bit more, but you're right. It's those little moments that I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Big Boss, I remember I sent you an essay that I wrote about it many years ago. Big Boss to me is, it's a brilliant film. I'm not sure if it's brilliant because the director was brilliant, or if it was just one of those things where everything came together in such a specific way that it ended up being that way. But either way, I think, there is so much amazing stuff in Big Boss that I think it's one of definitely Bruce's underrated. Certainly it has its fans, but I think it's underrated in terms of the pantheon of Bruce Lee films, whereas, you know, most fans will cite Fist of Fury, Enter the Dragon, Way of the Dragon as being, you know, gems, but Boss to me holds a very specific appeal. And I also believe it's one of Bruce's finest acting performances. It was actually my favorite of his in terms of just the acting portion of what he did in that movie. It was my favorite up until I saw The Orphan a few years back, which I brought to the States. It hadn't played here since the 1960s, but I was able to secure it and bring it. We screened it in New York and in Seattle. And that's an equally brilliant performance. Anybody that's a fan of Bruce Lee should check out that movie. It's hard to actually be able to get it. The only way you can do it is to actually go to the Hong Kong Film Archives and rent time to be able to see it there in their theater. But anybody that's interested in Bruce Lee as an artist should see that film, because his performance is just it's absolutely incredible. And I kind of see the acting performance that he did in Big Boss as kind of counterpoint to that. It's a bookend. The Orphan, the performance is very jazzed and animated. There's a bad boy persona that he perfected so well, partly because it wasn't acting, but he was like that in real life. But the performance was amazing. And then you have on the other end of the spectrum, Big Boss, which I view as such an understated performance. There's a James Dean quality to it, but the character is so unlike who Bruce Lee was in real life. And when you see it, with that slow burn that happens with it, it's a brilliant performance. It really is. And I don't think it gets enough recognition for being a brilliant performance. I mean, not even by Bruce Lee himself. He actually went on record saying that he didn't find the character that he played in the film, Cheng Chowan, as being, really that interesting of a character, which I totally disagree with. He said, he's a simple guy, and he's not the type of character that I want to play all the time. I totally understand that, but I think he kind of he underrated his own performance in that film, because I see a lot of nuance that he gave Cheng, and it's really apparent throughout the whole film. So it's definitely one of, if not my favorite, Bruce Lee performance from an acting standpoint.
Well said. I'm very happy to hear you describe that, and especially bring attention to Bruce Lee's performance in acting. And you bring up a couple things that I think, in particular, that I thought that they stand out. Especially, for example, you mentioned how the character in The Big Boss is actually not like Bruce Lee himself. In real
polar
life.
Opposite.
Yes.
Yeah.
And down to things like the drinking, and right. And so that I think adds a level of performance that really needs to be supported by some very well-established skills in acting in order to pull off. So that's one
thing.
It's
interesting. I'm sorry, I don't mean to cut you off, but
please.
I always, the way I describe it is that Boss is his most Eastern film in terms of the production values, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right. He had just come off of working in Hollywood for many years, and he had just shot in the Longstreet pilot. So, he goes to, the conditions in Bangkok, with the production values being, far, far inferior to, what he was used to in Hollywood. Yet and this kind of by extension makes sense, but it's his most Western performance in his most Eastern film. And by what I mean Western is that he hadn't really fully kind of committed himself to the presentational acting style that he would bring in Fist of Fury, which was very inspired by Chimbara cinema, as well as Way of the Dragon, which was almost Chaplin-esque in places. in terms of his character. And he wouldn't really kind of go back to that kind of representational style of acting until Enter the Dragon. So in many ways, Boss is kind of his most Western performance in a strange way, but it's his most Eastern film. You know, just by the look of it, you know, it's a very Eastern looking film. You know.
That is really fascinating. And before we move on, I want to say also that what struck me too, as I was hearing you describe it, was also, as you say, there are certain aspects of the production values, as we know, in terms of the budget, in terms of what was available, what wasn't available. And I think in many ways too, for me anyway, Bruce Lee's performance seems almost in a lot of, especially the really hefty emotional moments, it really seems to lift things and almost be like transcend the whatever limitations there might have otherwise been in terms of the actual specific limited budget or production value. So there is something of a transcending nature to his like some of the scenes where he's in shock or in sorrow and sadness because of all the violence that's happened and the death. And the very famous moment, of course, where he's pondering his future and everything, you know, sitting there alone, thinking, what is he going to do? It's a very, you know, one of the very famous shots of him as he's looking up, right before the final showdown.
I love that.
Yeah. Right, it's so delicate, and it's the quiet moments too, as well as the incredibly explosive and groundbreaking fight scenes that were there as well. But I'm so intrigued that you focus on that. So thank you so much.
Well, you know, I mean, the way I see it is this, right? Is I think because Bruce has become so mythological, right? In fact, he's I don't think there's another actor in cinema that has been mythologized as much as Bruce Lee. In the sense that the way most people tend to view him, even hardcore fans to a certain degree, right, is that they tend to see Bruce Lee just as being a persona, right? So, and that persona, it's kind of strange in the sense that they see him as this persona. It's because when you look at his films, it almost seems that people view the characters that he played as interchangeable. So why is that, right? Because they share similar traits, you know, the same hairstyle, the same fighting stances, the war cries that he developed and expressions, you know, that kind of have become his brand and have come to define who Bruce Lee is. That all the nuance that he gave the actual characters in the films has kind of fallen by the wayside. Because if you look at his movies, his adult films, he never played the same character twice. Each character, from The Big Boss to Fist of Fury to Way of the Dragon to Game of Death and Enter the Dragon, are very different characters. Arguably, the character that most resembles him in real life is Hai Tian in Game of Death, in the sense that the character is very Western, and he uses American colloquialisms. He is wearing a one-piece tracksuit that's very modern. He comes across as very cocky, mocking. You know, that's really the closest. But when you look at his other characters, he doesn't get enough credit. Bruce does not get enough credit for being an actor and an artist. People tend to view him as a martial art god that just happened to make movies. And nothing could be further from the truth. This was a kid that, you know, was, you know, making movies when, you know, the first time he's ever been on screen was when he was a baby. And he, you know, he was a child actor, and he grew into a teen idol. You know, because most people have not checked out those movies, you know, they just tend to see Bruce as the actualized martial art god that came to cinema in the early 70s. But if you look at him in terms of what he did, both from his screen fighting and choreography that he did, as well as his acting, you're clearly looking at a person who's an artist, an actor and an artist. His sensibilities and what he was able to do on screen came more from those aesthetics than they did from his martial arts skills. Yeah, I know. It's a controversial statement. And I'm sure there's some people that be like, what are you talking about? That's the truth. If you look at what Bruce did on film, there's a Nureyev type of precision to what he does. You don't just get that there have been hundreds of martial artists that have made the transition into movies. Why has there not been one that has come across the same way as Bruce? It's because they did not have those aesthetics to begin with. They were martial artists, great martial artists, and somebody said, you look great, let me put you in a film. And they made films, and some of them were successful, some of them were good, but I'm talking about that raw aesthetic that Bruce Lee brought to cinema and to his fight choreography, and even to the way he presented himself on screen. Those came from an artist's aesthetic, not from a martial artist's aesthetic. And I think that a lot of times that kind of gets lost in translation because the myth is so big, right? The myth of the martial god is so big, it casts a long shadow on everything else.
Oh, that's a very interesting way that's an interesting perspective, because we are, of course, talking too about works of cinema. And you're right, they are stories, and they are stories that are not, I don't think, meant to be taken as being specifically, right, Bruce Lee now goes to Italy, right? And of course, it's starring Bruce Lee, but he has a different name, right? His name is not Bruce Lee, it's Tang Long, and he's in a different situation that is that, as we know, is different from his real life. And that's an example. So yes, of course, there is this interesting mix of what we see as Bruce Lee and what that means to all of us, and then also looking at it as works of cinema and how it was crafted as a piece of cinema. And so I think that perspective is very important to have. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, of course, a big part of what drives that is that also in the history of cinema, there's never really been anybody like Bruce Lee, right? In the sense that he took something that he was very passionate about, okay, which was martial art, and he found a way to be able to parlay that into this other passion that he had, which is acting. And he kind of brought the two things together and became the face of everything martial as a result. So there's also a sense in that big martial god mythology that people see him as an emissary for martial arts in general. So, the lines become very blurred. One of the biggest things that happens, that you see people talking about, in forums and, in other places as well. And recently on Better Call Saul, the TV show, is who would win in a fight, Bruce Lee or so-and-so, Bruce Lee or Muhammad Ali, Bruce Lee or Hickson Gracie, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Here's a second somewhat controversial statement. Bruce Lee was not a fighter. Now, Bruce Lee could fight and could defend himself, but he was not a fighter. Fighters get paid to fight. Fighters fight. Now, somebody could say, well, what about street fighters? They don't get paid to fight. Couldn't he have been a street fighter? No, because if he was a street fighter, he would have probably either ended up in jail or dead. Street fights don't have any rules. If you kick somebody's ass in the street and they get pissed off, the next day they could come back and they just shoot you. They're not going to get into another fight. So you either end up in jail or you end up dead if you were a person that consistently fights in the street and gets a reputation as a street fighter. So, again, was Bruce Lee a fighter? He wasn't a fighter. Could Bruce defend himself? I absolutely have no doubt on my mind that he could defend himself. But that doesn't make himself a fighter, I've studied martial arts since the age of 13. I've done many different systems, and I still do and teach to this day. I would never consider myself or call myself a fighter, though. I'm a student of combat, and I can successfully defend myself, but that's very different than being a fighter. So, that's, again, part of the whole thing. When you become the face of something, the lines get blurred, and all of a sudden people are starting to refer to you as something that you're not. The only example that I've ever seen in cinema that kind of comes close to that, but not even then, it's not quite the same way, is Stallone in the Rocky films, where the character became so iconic that the lines are actually blurred between Sylvester Stallone and Rocky. People think a lot of times that Stallone and Rocky, Rocky is Stallone's alter ego in a way, but they're not the same person, like you'll just pick out any interview, and you'll see him saying, people have come up to me, they think that I speak like Rocky and that I'm dumb. You know what I mean? It's like, look, man, I wrote the script, I directed, four or five of the movies. I'm not the character, even though you love the character so much and you see me as being that. They think of him as a boxer. And let's to talk about boxing, go look up an interview where he talks about getting in the ring when he was auditioning fighters for Rocky 3. He got so cocky for a moment that he actually got in the ring with Joe Frazier, thinking that maybe he could not beat him, but hold his own a little bit against Joe Frazier. Well, it was a very sobering experience. He talks about leaving the ring after a couple of minutes and walking to the men's room and throwing up because the shot was so hard, and it was right in his body. It was a body shot that he tried to kind of play off like, oh, okay, that's cool. I'm gonna man up and walk away and act like everything's good. I'm just gonna go to the bathroom, and then you go to the bathroom and you hurl. So again, I see a parallel a little bit, within that, with the Rocky character and Stallone, and how people view Bruce Lee and come at Bruce Lee. Only with Bruce Lee, it's so much larger. Yeah. So much larger, Again, he's viewed literally as an emissary for martial arts, and the line gets blurred between watching the magnificent balletic precision that he brought to film, and it's so good that it fools you into thinking that it's real. And again, I don't want to, I'm not trying to say by what I'm saying that Bruce Lee was not the real deal. He was an incredible martial artist, but there's a difference between, being a martial artist that's really, really good and somebody that, can take on anybody in the world. There is no such thing as that, because what's the scenario? Scenario dictates everything as to who can take on who. If you're having a bad day, or if you get caught in a situation where you weren't expecting something, some days you're the windshield, some days you're the bug. So I'm always bemused by these conversations, but it's something that still goes on to this day, and it speaks really highly of, again, the mythology of Bruce Lee and how people view him.
And the power of
cinema,
his cinema and cinema
right.
In general. You're absolutely right. So it becomes, and it becomes something where, right, and I think also the power of cinema, and one of the aims of good cinema is to create the sense of sort of this legend, or
right.
And so I think when we're talking about the world of Bruce Lee and Bruce Lee in general, of course, people know him, or many people around the world know him. For instance, I know him through watching his films, and so that has built up in my own mind so much. And so his films obviously therefore carry great import and great weight and meaning for me, and obviously for many people. And so I think that's a very important point. And so with that, of course, the films. And so you've spoken about your approach to the films and your takes on the films, and Big Boss in particular, which I thought was great. And now I want to ask you about Game of Death. And it's a pretty complicated topic,
It
as
is.
you know. And so I don't think we can get to all the specific nuances here today. But for anyone just in general who may still be coming at this for the first time, could you just give us your quick, brief sort of Game of Death 101, as it were, as to what were some of the circumstances? Let's start with the film itself. So could you tell us what the film, the 78 film, what that is, and how that does or does not reflect what had been planned prior to Bruce Lee's passing? So could you start maybe from there?
Sure. So, the 78 film was kind of put together a bit haphazardly. It was not indicative at all of Bruce's initial vision of what Game of Death was supposed to be. So it bears the name Game of Death only in name. The film itself, it kind of plays out like a fantasy version of maybe the last year or two of Bruce's life, like a heightened version, almost like a semi-biographical tale of a martial arts actor who's becoming incredibly successful, or has become incredibly successful, and is being pressed by the mob to basically manage his career. So he ends up faking his own death and kind of going underground and coming back and taking out these people who won't leave him and his girlfriend alone. So it kind of almost reads like a concoction of conspiracy theories of how Bruce Lee died and what might have been, kind of almost like a superhero version of what his life would have looked like in a parallel universe, as written by, somebody who was doing a Marvel film and whatnot. But, the film itself was my first, again, cinematic experience of Bruce Lee. So it's a bit of a guilty pleasure for me. And, I know that there are other fans that kind of feel the same way as well. I'll talk about first and foremost the thing that astounded me, besides the actual 11 minutes of footage that we got of Bruce at the end, which was mind blowing. I mean, that was my first time seeing him ever, and I was just blown away. I walked out of that movie theater in awe, in absolute awe. But if I'm going to dissect the film itself and go back to the things that I think that are very strong and that work in that film, are first, John Barry's incredible score. To this day, it's my favorite Bruce Lee theme. Big Boss comes close, but Game of Death is just on another level. It illustrates so many nuances. The soundtrack is it's equally melancholy, ominous, heroic, and at times it even feels classical. So, John Barry totally knocked it out of the park, and I can't think of Game of Death without hearing his music. It's just not possible. The other thing that I think that they did really well was the opening. That kind of riffed a little bit on the James Bond theme in terms of how they shot it, but it worked so well using the Way of the Dragon footage, the fight with Bruce and Chuck Norris in the Coliseum, and again set to the music, going in and out, and the way they framed it was beautiful. So, like, to me, the first opening, shot of that, the first 3 minutes or 4 minutes of the credits at the beginning, and the 11 minutes of real Bruce Lee footage that we got at the end, and John Barry's score, that's all I needed. That to me is enough to make it a great film. I use the word great, again, in the context of what I'm referencing here. The other thing that I think worked really well was Sammo Hung's fight choreography for the Bruce Lee doubles, specifically the locker scene, the locker fight scene with Bob Wall. And, I even like the one that takes place on the first night where they're outside the restaurant and they kind of end up kicking the Bruce Lee's character's ass. But I thought it was very well choreographed. So, I think, to me, it's Sammo Hung's best work. I know that there will be people that will say, are you kidding me? Sammo did a lot better here, there, and there. But I thought that he was able to replicate some of that pop in Bruce's own choreography, which is no small feat. Not many people can do it. It's, a case of like often imitated but never duplicated. So those things I work really well. Of course, on the flip side, things like using Bruce's real life funeral footage is unforgivable. So it's a mixed bag with that film, but I still come back to that whatever works in that film works really, really well. So, most of the time I give it a pass, although I have my days where I'm just like,
Yeah.
But again, it was my first, there's also, I'm looking at it through a nostalgic lens. I definitely know that because it was my first Bruce Lee film. Kind of moving away from that, Bruce's original concept for Game of Death has been spelled out, so many times in the Warrior's Journey documentary and Artport. And, over the years, I think what was really interesting is that before we knew all of this, we would get glimpses of some of that footage in documentaries like Bruce Lee, the Legend. So that kind of kickstarted that, along with the rumors and articles, that had come out during the time that he was alive, that were talking about Game of Death. That's why I refer to it as this kind of big Rubik's Cube, because we were always constantly looking for that new piece of information to connect the dots to kind of see what Bruce's real vision for this movie was. And thankfully, his notes were found in the late 90s, and John Little, put them out on the Warrior's Journey documentary and the Warrior's Journey book that actually has his script treatment in the notes for the fights and in there. So big thanks to John for doing that, or else we would have never seen that.
So yes, John Little and Warrior's Journey is in many ways very integral and crucial here for this to have an understanding of what how should I put it, what could have been, and right. So what we have here, obviously, for obviously people who know this will obviously know this, but just in case people who don't know this, so what happened, right, was that after Bruce Lee's directorial debut, which was The Way of the Dragon, after that was made, of course, Bruce Lee wanted to plan his next film that he would direct, right, which would be Game of Death, and it would have to do with there would be some story involving maybe I know you describe it very well in the opening titles of your Redux, but right. it would involve some kind of kidnapping, and it would involve ultimately going to a particular pagoda in South Korea somewhere, yes. or that location, and then the concept would therefore be the each level of the pagoda would have a particular martial artist, or a particular artist, and the style that such artists would be representing, and it would be Bruce Lee and other people obviously would be trying to progress their way one level at a time to reach some kind of destination, whatever that final end goal is, which is an interesting right. thing. But the point here was that this was generally speaking, this was the concept of progressing one level, one stage is at a time upwards, and each level would bring a different kind of adversary, which would lead to different fighting styles and how to try to figure out how to best this adversary, etc. And so this was the general concept, right?
Mhm.
And then the general concept was there was some footage that was shot, and there was and what survives is known as this sort of footage, right? And then unfortunately, Bruce Lee passed away. Of course, he went and was involved in Enter the Dragon, but then afterwards, unfortunately, of course, he left this world much too soon. And
Right.
one of course, many tragedies associated with that. And he, of course, left behind the work that was, as of then, not completed, right? Which was at the time that concept of Game of Death. And then
Right.
a few years later, the studio powers that be decided to try to use what existing footage there was to try to fashion from there, or based around that, a story of some sort that ended up becoming the 78 version of Game of Death that was released in theaters, that is now the official uh, film, and that's part of the packaging and releases from Criterion and elsewhere. But what we're dealing with is really two really separate concepts.
Absolutely.
And
Yeah.
so the Game of Death 78 version is one concept that I think most people will know, but there is the other concept that of Game of Death. And so that is where Game of Death Redux, I think, comes in. But so could you just maybe further elaborate on that, or maybe make some corrections where I might have made some errors? Just maybe fill in, or maybe add anything more that you think would be helpful for anyone who might be interested in hearing this background before we get into Game of Death Redux specifically. So could you just fill in any more comments about that background?
No, I think you said it beautifully. The only thing that I would add is that one of the questions that usually comes up is, why did the filmmakers in 1977, 78 not just use Bruce's original concept? That way they could have used the full footage, et cetera, et cetera. And why do it the way they did it? And there's really two reasons for that. One, the concept had kind of gotten out. The cat was out of the bag soon after Bruce died, through publications, et cetera, et cetera. People kind of got wind of what his overall idea was for the 1972 version that he was doing of Game of Death. And it kind of leaked out, and all the whole explosion of the Bruceploitation era, where you had the people being hired. It was being billed as a Bruce Lee film, but it was basically a stand-in, and there were several of them that were really popular at the time. They all did their own version of that 1972 concept. They didn't execute it well, but it was a story that was kind of out there. So I think by the time Raymond Chow and Robert Klaus started working on Game of Death 1978, they kind of viewed it as like a story that had been done several times, and it just kind of didn't. It would have been too much of the same old thing, but it also, in tandem with that, I also feel that from a marketing standpoint, they felt that it would be more interesting to do kind of this heightened version of Bruce Lee's bio, in a weird way. You know what I mean? And when I say a bio, it would be, again, a bio of like the last 2 years of his life where he became successful, not obviously a full encompassing bio. But I mean, there's just so much in there that's like that. Like even, scenes where you see the Bruce Lee double, and he's he's sitting in his dressing room, and he's applying makeup, and you clearly see pictures of Bruce Lee's childhood films. So in a weird way, it's kind of like setting you up to believe this is Bruce Lee. This character is really Bruce Lee and is based on like Bruce Lee's entire life. He was a child actor. He was making movies when he was young. And, you know, his career path, if I had to guess, you know, would have followed exactly the same way as the real life Bruce Lee. And then he becomes successful. And then we'll just add this heightened thing about the mob. That really makes for good storytelling in film, and it will give it, you know, the film a central conflict. And then that's an excuse to get us to the multi-level pagoda, which at that point had become a restaurant. But, you know, c'est la vie. You know, I mean, I kind of get why they did it. I kind of get why they decided not to fall. I mean, it's tragic in the sense that we didn't get to see the full footage in 1978, but I understand their motivation from a filmmaking perspective of why they probably didn't want to revisit that. And their attitude was probably, you know, like, we don't need to see those two other guys go up the pagoda with Bruce. Let's just try to cut it to Bruce. But even there, you know, there were shots that they could have used that didn't include those guys in there that they chose not to. You know, and again, I'm not going to knock it too much because it comes down to an individual filmmaker's perspective on the story that they wanted to tell. So, you know, it's a love-hate relationship for me. Clearly, right?
Or to borrow a line from the film itself, you know, time is money, time is money, or something like that.
Right, so, time is exactly.
So that then brings us, I think, very nicely to the concept, right? The concept of the film that was envisioned, that was planned as we understand it to be by Bruce Lee, and what ended up being the so-called footage, right? These scenes that were shot. So with that, could you then tell us your approach? How did you begin to be involved? How did this project start in terms of what ended up becoming Game of Death Redux?
So, you know, it was totally unexpected. What happened was at the end of 2018, I brought The Orphan to the US, as I told you, and we screened it in 2 places. And Matthew Polly, who had just released Bruce Lee: A Life, which, you know, is by far the best Bruce Lee bio that's out there, and I've read many of them. Nothing compares to this one. So he joined me on stage for the presentation of The Orphan. And like I said, we screened it in New York and Seattle. And during that time, I was talking to him saying, you know, I kind of had this idea of, you know, for a very long time to do Game of Death, but using the John Barry score, but with, you know, the full footage. And it was something that I always talked about doing or thought about doing. But just kind of always kicked it down the road. So I think, you know, part of what spurred me on was being able to do this thing with The Orphan, which is mid-2018. And at the end of 2018, I kind of just said, well, let me just, you know, put my money where my mouth is, literally, and kind of commit to seeing what could come out of this. So I spent about 6 months just poring over, you know, the Game of Death footage. Now, I didn't have access to the raw footage itself, so I was working off of what came off the 1978 film and the Japanese art port version. I would have liked to have looked at and used some stuff off of A Warrior's Journey, but the footage quality didn't match the art port stuff, because art port had actually remastered their footage at the time. Of course, a remastering job would be, you know, standard definition by now, but it was still, you know, the best footage out there of the complete footage, the best quality footage. So I was just kind of meticulously going through all the different footages and trying to put together this Frankenstein monster. And what happened was Anthony Wong at the Asian American Institute got wind of it. We had talked, and he said, well, when you're done with it, why don't we screen it here at ARI? And I was like, wow, okay, really, you want to screen it? And he said, yeah. So I put together what was really just kind of like an initial first draft, and we screened it, and the reaction was very, very, very positive. But, you know, I still wasn't satisfied. There was a lot of stuff that I still wanted to kind of work out. And I spent another 6 months just kind of going through that. And during that time, Criterion reached out to Matthew Pauly to do some commentaries for the films. And it was through Matt that they learned about my edit. And he introduced me to the producer, Curtis Chu, who basically, you know, said, I would like to see Redux. And I sent it to him. And then less than 24 hours later, he came back to me and said that he loved it, that he thought it was an amazing presentation, and that they wanted to use it, you know, as a supplement on the Game of Death Blu-ray disc. And it was totally unexpected. So, you know, I have Matt Pauly to thank for the introduction, and I have Curtis and Criterion to thank for seeing, you know, the work on its own merits and deeming it worthy of a Criterion release. So that's the long answer to a short story.
And of course, it then it got its so tell me then, so the Criterion release, my understanding is that this is the first time that it was made available to to a wide audience, right, outside of, let's say, screenings that were held in certain locations. So
exactly, yeah, it was just one screening, you know, and that happened in July of 2019, and then yeah, the next time anybody saw it would be on the Criterion release.
That's amazing. That is such an amazing story. And so congratulations, of course, are in order to you for all that that has happened. So that's really great. I'm also I must ask you, so therefore could you let us in, give us some insight into your thinking and philosophy and approach when making Game of Death Redux? So as you referred to, there were already a lot of existing materials around that you relied upon or that you read. So what were some of those? I mean, you mentioned a little bit already of what you relied upon, but as you were reviewing these materials, what was your approach to the material, and how did that affect or otherwise dictate the way in which you wanted to make Game of Death Redux? I suppose another way that we could I could ask this question is, what is your philosophy as to what the concept of this Game of Death, this Bruce Lee's Game of Death, what is your view and philosophy as to what this concept is and what it means?
Well, so Game of Death is a multifaceted work of art, really. You know, the major, you know, the kind of like the stuff on the surface is that it's basically a tutorial on Jeet Kune Do and stressing the adaptability factor, you know, with having the different guardians being of a different style, whereas, you know, Bruce's character adapts to the different styles and has, as a result, no style, which is, you know, kind of encompasses the JKD philosophy. So, and that's kind of what's been really stressed over the years as being what the film was about. And while it certainly does have an aspect of that, I personally believe that there's a deeper in the sense that there's another layer there. And I'm not saying that it's a better interpretation, but there's definitely another layer of interpretation there that I think is missed. And I'll get, to that in a second, but to kind of give you an idea, when I approached the film, initially, I just wanted to make a version of Game of Death that spoke to me. And this is not a knock on John Little and A Warrior's Journey, or the people that produced the art version. I respect both works. It's an incredibly hard, thing to do, in terms of, trying to put making a film is hard. There's so many things that come up that people, don't even know that aren't filmmakers. So anybody who's actually able to do it, I champion that. But on a personal level, I just feel that those presentations didn't give the depth to Game of Death that I felt existed in there. And on top of that, I didn't feel that the way those films were cut illustrated the most dramatic and compelling narrative, just personally speaking. So I wanted to basically, my intent was to make a version that spoke to me, that reflected those themes. And to do that, I basically, I came at the footage from the viewpoint of storytelling and filmmaking. I always say, and many people before me have said, a film is really made 3 times. Once when you write the script and you're envisioning the project of what it's going to look like. 2, when you actually go out and shoot the film. So all the things that come up, then all the obstacles you have to face, all the things that go wrong, all the moments that, end up being serendipity. That's the process. And then the 3rd time, and this is the one that people don't really pay as much attention to, despite people that are not filmmakers, is in the editing stage, where you literally have the ability to cut entirely different films with the same footage that was shot, depending on the choices, depending on how, where you put the music, where you put the Foley, where you cut, the angles, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And in many ways, the editing stage is kind of the most creative in that regard. And, again, I came to the footage trying to basically get at the heart of what I felt was the story that was being told. I honestly believe that the story that Bruce wanted to tell was really the pagoda, the story of the pagoda. This is evident in the fact that he struggled with the rest of the script for a long time. I think there was a part of him that realized that the pagoda motif that comprised the second or the latter half of the film was not as was much more philosophically rich than the first half, which was the setup. The whole stuff that you discussed about the family being kidnapped. It was just a means of an end, the means to an end to get to the pagoda. And it's almost, in a weird way, because of that, the pagoda footage in of itself almost works as its own independent short film. It's kind of bizarre in that sense. It really shouldn't work that way, but it kind of does. And to get back to the theme, I think that the surface level stuff is really kind of like that JKD tutorial of stressing flexibility, adaptation, et cetera, et cetera. But I think that the deeper aspect of the story kind of resides in the idea that the pagoda is really a metaphor for the human psyche, and that the challenges that are presented on each floor are different layers of the psyche. And Bruce was, he had read a lot of the works of psychologist Carl Jung, and a lot of that stuff ended up going into the Silent Flute project that he was working on with James Coburn and Sterling Silfant. And this goes back to what I said earlier about how I believe that, you know, Bruce was really kind of trying to work out his own brand of martial arts films that leaned heavily on psychology as well as philosophy. And the psychological, it's the Game of Death Pagoda, the footage that's in the pagoda shares much in common with what he was doing with the whole overall idea of silent flute. And so if you look at the pagoda as being a metaphor or an allegory for the human psyche, then the obstacles and the guardians that he's facing are really kind of aspects of himself that he has to face, and before he can actually get to the next level of enlightenment. And you know, it's kind of like the story is almost like a spiritual rebirth that is born through the rigors of combat. But even, you know, when we get, like, for instance, if we could get to the first level where he fights Dan Inosanto, Dan is clearly an amazing martial artist, but there is a mirror aspect to how they relate to one another and move, you know, around each other, mimicking the same actions, as well as at the same time, there's an aspect to, you know, Bruce keeps mocking Dan and indicating that, you know, he's too stiff and that he's too basically, he's too confined to the script. And he's, you know, he's not improvisational enough to be able to keep up with Bruce's character. But in that, there's a sense that you can kind of see that Dan is almost what Bruce's character might have been at one stage in his life, before he found total combative freedom. That to me is very, whenever I watch the footage, whenever I see them kind of interacting, that's what I'm taking out of it. And, you know, kind of parenthetical to that also is that they both share the same moniker. The Hall of the Tiger, which is Dan's floor, is kind of synonymous with Bruce's fighting moniker, High Tan's fighting moniker, which is the yellow-faced tiger. So it's essentially the tiger versus the tiger. There's a huge parallel there. When you get to the next stage, where he fights Jihan Jay, it was always interesting to me that was the Hall of the Dragon. Now, the dragon is, you know, what we normally associate with Bruce. You know, he is the dragon. Enter the dragon, the little dragon. And there's a sense of, you know, regality to Jihan Jay's character, from the way he presents himself, the way he walks with the gold trim on his gi, that kind of beautiful hair, the pompadour, and they're not quite a pompadour, but kind of almost there. And the struggle that happens between them, you know, it's interesting that he chose grappling. You know, again, grappling can also be said, well, you know, he wanted to show all the ranges of combat and how JKD could adapt to that. But at the same time, there's an allegorical aspect to the fact that they're grappling, that Bruce is grappling with the demons in his own psyche. And in the end, you know, how does he defeat G? He breaks G's back. So is there an irony, or is there a message there that Bruce Lee breaks the dragon? What is he trying to say, right? When you get to Kareem's floor, this is Bruce going fully expressionistic as a filmmaker, in that the Kareem character, you know, for years people have wondered what he was supposed to represent, and they look at the eyes and they look at the fact that he's light sensitive, and, you know, they wonder whether he was a mutant or a vampire, or, you know, a scientific experiment gone wrong. What was he supposed to be? And, you know, to me, it's pretty obvious that fight is not even really a literal fight. It's certainly a physical fight, but it's so metaphorical in scope. And the fact that Kareem represents Bruce's Jungian shadow. That's who he is. down to the lizard eyes to personify that. You know, it's not meant to be literal. You're not supposed to wonder, what is he? Is he a vampire? Is he a mutant? No, he's the physical manifestation of Bruce's shadow self. And how does Bruce defeat him? He literally brings the light onto his shadow and is able to defeat him. So really heady, deep, symbolic stuff that your average person, you know, wouldn't get. Of course, Bruce didn't invent this stuff, and Carl Jung didn't invent this stuff. Carl, you know, certainly brought it to the table and kind of named these archetypes so that they were recognizable. But you know, the archetypes themselves, and especially the shadow aspect, has been used in many tropes in the course of movies and literature for hundreds of years. You know, just look at Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and Frankenstein, and you know, even, you know, modern day, the Incredible Hulk, or you know, even if you want to get into Frank Miller's Batman: The Dark Knight Returns, there are aspects of the Jungian shadow in all of these things, and it's a wonderful storytelling device. And I really believe that when Bruce talked about making multi-level films in a Hong Kong interview, that's where he was going. You know, he had just come off of the disappointment of The Silent Flute, but he had been working on it for over 3 years with an Academy Award-winning writer who studied all this stuff, and an actor that, you know, loved all this type of stuff. So the conversations that were had, the ideas, the metaphors, all that stuff kind of gestated, and they found their way into Bruce's films, you know, in big ways and in small ways. In Game of Death, it's bigger, but there are aspects of things in Silent Flute that you see creep up in all of his movies. So, you know, again, I feel that he was really going for finding the type of martial art film that would become his brand, where he was able to not only kind of get these bigger themes across in terms of his art, his martial art, but also from the perspective of good storytelling and using psychology along with philosophy. And, you know, of course, you know, Carl Jung's work was a huge inspiration on Joseph Campbell, who, you know, came up with the hero's journey arc that was pushed so heavily around the time of Warrior's Journey, where, you know, John Little spoke about the hero's journey and the work of Joseph Campbell in relation to Bruce. Well, you know, a lot of that stuff was inspired by Carl Jung. So it was quite obvious to me when I was looking at the footage, and that's what I wanted to portray. That's what I wanted to tell with Redux. And that's the story that I felt was kind of aching to come alive. And the way I was able to do it was by using John Barry's amazing score that reflected, that I feel in a way kind of sonically told the story. Sometimes I wonder whether he actually was privy to the whole entire footage when he composed this, because it's almost too perfect. I can't believe that he just composed it off of 11 minutes worth of footage, but maybe I'm wrong. But you know, so John Barry his score was super crucial to telling the story. And then the other part of it was making sure that the pacing and the cutting of the film accurately reflected Bruce's own sense of pacing when he cut his fight scenes, which I felt were missing from the previous versions. You know, again, part of that is due to people want to keep as much footage of Bruce as possible down to the last frame. But while that's great for fan service and in terms of, you know, people being able to see everything, that's not how people cut films. And that doesn't lend itself to telling the story that needs to be told. So, you know, those really were my driving forces when I was making Redux.
That is very, very interesting, to say the least.
Well, again, Daisuke, I gave you the long answer to a short story.
No, no, no. I think that was brilliant. If I could then ask you before we move on to specifically, then, in your view, do you think that his character, in fact, reaches enlightenment at the end? I mean, I feel like there is, on paper, one could say that, and based on of course the progression and the ultimate conclusion of what happens at the end with Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and that's and everything is fine now. But I don't know. There seems to be a bit of ambiguity um, in terms of the way he carries himself, and what now what, that sort of feeling is in the air. So I wonder what you
Yeah.
feel about that.
Well, it's kind of what I want to believe. Of course, the ending in of itself, as much as Bruce struggled with the setup for the pagoda, he also, as you know, struggled a lot with the ending, what the ending was going to be. In fact, there's a story where he tells Andre Morgan that while they were shooting, when he got called off to do Enter the Dragon, that he was happy to kind of give up Game of Death because he hadn't thought of the perfect ending, and now he had more time to kind of review it and think about what he wanted to do. But and of course, there's been many rumors, which I'm sure you've read online, about what was supposed to be on the top level of the pagoda. Some people say that again, there was nothing. He would draw back the curtain, and there would be a mirror which reflected, literally, pun intended there, reflected the ending of Silent Flute. And I don't know what he would have ended up doing. I don't think, there's a part of me that feels that it's not as simple as just the mirror being there. I do believe that the character, in some way, despite his wariness when he's coming back down at the end, did reach, or was on his way to realizing that he reached a level of enlightenment through the combat and battles that he had just went through. But it wasn't like a revelatory moment where he's standing there going, yes. I think that would have come actually in the next couple of scenes, if anything, or at least that's what I want to believe. That's how I feel it would be. But I agree with you. I mean, like one of the decisions I made, like I often got asked this question by people that I've done other interviews with, and I've seen stuff online. Why did you decide to cut Bruce's dialogue with Kareem? In the original version and the other versions, you see, Kareem and Bruce kind of have this exchange at the beginning, and then at the end, they talk about death, et cetera, et cetera. And for me, I always felt, as part of the Jungian shadow motif, that Kareem really worked better as a silent figure. He's much more ominous that way. Further to that, the dialogue that they have between them at the beginning, how do I put this without getting into more trouble? I think it was dated and kind of a bit reflective of bad tough guy banter. And look, there's going to be a contingent of people that say, how dare you? That Bruce wrote that, and who are you to say that it was bad dialogue and decide to take it out? Just play it the way he wanted it. I honestly believe that Bruce would have come to that conclusion himself, because what you shoot isn't necessarily what you keep. Again, film is made 3 times. The notes and what he shot is indicative of covering all of his bases, right? You can choose to take things out, but if you never put them in to begin with, then you don't have anything to draw from. And I think that a lot of people miss that, again, when they're coming, at the Bruce Lee myth. He wrote that in his notes and he shot it, so that's indicative of what he was going to keep. No, it's not. It's not indicative of anything except the fact that he shot it and that he was playing with it. Like, if we went back to Way of the Dragon, how many things do you think he would have cut out there? Somebody would say, well, I don't know how many things he would have cut. Yeah, you don't know because you're not a filmmaker. I can guarantee you that there's a lot of things that he cut out because there's no director that comes out of the gate and everything that they shoot and everything that they write makes it into the film. When you're editing a film, you see what works. You see that there are pacing issues. What you thought was brilliant when you were shooting it ends up, you think it sucks when you're looking back at it. So I'm not going to put that in there. That needs to go. So, you know, and again, Game of Death was a work in progress. So there's, you know, anybody that puts their spin or decides to cut this, it's just a filmmaker's interpretation of what Game of Death is, since Bruce is no longer alive. You know, there's an equal argument to say that, you know, he wouldn't have used that line as much as saying he would have used that line. So, you know, I kind of went off on a tangent there, but some of the choices that I made was really in an effort to tell the most dramatic story, and to tell it in a way that I felt, you know, was reflective of what that subtext that Bruce wanted in there. I think I kind of went off so much on a tangent here, Daisuke, that I probably forgot what you were first asking me. And I know it had something to do with my choices, I think, with the way the footage was, and in terms of did the character feel like he reached enlightenment, et cetera, et cetera. But I do, you know, to get back to that, I do think that there was a deeper understanding there of something that wasn't there before. And I know where I was going with this. The choice that I made not to have anybody shout back to him when he descends and gets back to the first floor. So in the other cuts, you know, he calls out for help again a second time, and they come back, you know, they shout back to him and they say, you know, they just tell him to come down. In my version, I chose not to have a response, because I felt that it was much more resonant that way. In that moment, he truly understands that he's totally alone in this mission. And it was just, to me, it felt a much better way to end it, where he gets no response, kind of puts his head down and continues to descend the stairs. So, you know, those are some of the reasons why I chose to do what I did. It was all in service of telling the most dramatic and succinct narrative that I could in terms of what I felt Bruce's message was.
Oh, I think that's I mean, that's great. I mean, I mean, you are the filmmaker, right? And so this was your mission, and I mean, you made it, and not just you directed it, but we also we see your vision. We also actually hear a little bit of your voice, if I'm not mistaken. So there's a lot of you there. So this is a project that is very much a reflection of you and your viewpoints, as well as the presentation of the footage. So yeah, so I think that's right. And incidentally, yes, so that is your voice too, correct?
I looped Bruce's voice. Here's the thing with Bruce's voice. I'm not going to comment on other people who have voiced Bruce, right? Bruce spoke very distinctly in that he had a Hong Kong British accent. And I've heard many people impersonate Bruce's voice, and they do a relatively good job. I've never come across anybody that is able to enunciate and do the voice, to do the voice perfectly, that also has the same pitch as Bruce. This includes all the people that have played him in bios and plays as well. To me, they always come across as sounding as Bruce Lee impersonators. My own personal feeling with that is that if it was going to be fucked up, let me do it myself. Because I don't want to sit there and blame somebody for all my years to come. It's like, you never did it right. It's difficult. To be fair, I felt that, my enunciation was good, but obviously my voice is deeper than Bruce's. Some people like it, some people hate it.
There you go. Sorry about that. I think that's one thing too that I wanted to ask you, which was the how should I put it? How do you are you happy with how people are reacting to the work and how it has appeared here as part of the Criterion package?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, with the Criterion package, I'm really happy with the presentation, how they put everything together. It's a beautiful box set, and they touch on so many things. I think, one of the things, not to go off on a tangent, that I thought was great is that they dedicated a portion to the voice dubbers, Michael Kay. And, that was really, really interesting to me, especially, when you think back to all those films and, you hear the Fist of Fury dubbing, and it's just so iconic in terms of the way he speaks there. In terms of the reviews for Redux, everything that I've actually read has been a really good review that comes from, somebody that's actually a reviewer. That's reviewing something or that has a blog up. I'm pretty happy. I've yet to really read a bad review where they said that they didn't like, the way the footage was put together. There's a certain contingent of fans, that I'm sure don't like it or prefer the other presentations. And, that's fine too. One doesn't necessarily replace the other. Again, it just comes down to, aesthetics and what it is that you're looking and what it is that you understand. I mean, if the only goal is just to see as much of Bruce, as you possibly can and have everything there, then, that's great. You can go back to those presentations. I was trying to do something a little different and get to kind of like to the roots and go at, drill down like a layer or two deeper than, what was there. And, that's not always for everybody. So, the beautiful thing is that there are many presentations that you can look at, and, whatever floats your boat is the one that you can pop in your Blu-ray player.
Well said, my friend. Well said. And it's a fascinating realm of exploration and entertainment and real food for thought and philosophy and so much more. That is the world of Bruce Lee. And I think you and your great efforts with Game of Death Redux has you've really contributed to that for a lot of people. And I think for a lot of people, who are maybe coming to the world of Bruce Lee for the first time, say with the Criterion set that you mentioned, I think a lot of people are actually maybe learning about Bruce Lee. And one of the difficult aspects, I will say, one of the difficult things is how to reconcile the film Game of Death with the rest of the filmography. I mean, you said it. It's almost like a love-hate relationship. Almost. I'm talking about
Right.
the official release version. And so
Yeah.
I think, therefore, with Game of Death, I mean, of course, we can appreciate it and enjoy it on its own merits. And you say you do, and I do as well. But we also have to acknowledge that it does have certain aspects that could be said to be flawed or incomplete, or perhaps really call out to something of a what could have been type of reaction. And so therefore, we really need as much information and background that we can get. And I think part of that, very significantly, can come from watching the footage as presented and edited by Game of Death Redux. And I think that can really it can help to present the story as it was intended, put together in this presentation. And also this can shed further light, as you say, into the mind and philosophy of Bruce Lee and his approach to not just martial arts, but to life. And I think that is very important. So the more information that we can get to fill in the gaps on this, as you say, Rubik's Cube of an enigma that is Game of Death, I think the better off we all are. And so I want to thank you so much for your great efforts in doing this. I think it's been a great pleasure for me to look at this Redux through your perspective.
Thank you so much, Daisuke. You know, I appreciate the kind words, and you know, I hope you enjoyed it.
Oh, I did very much, and I really enjoyed your take on it now, because it helps me to gain a different perspective on the concept, and now I can see the notion of the expression of the psyche, as you say, and the duality, and also the concept of the journey and the destination. And this it seems to be very much about the journey as well as anything else, which I think is a very key concept when we're talking about expressions of stories of enlightenment, especially in myth and legend and even cinema. So this has been incredible.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think it was tough again, you know, for Bruce to I think that's part of the reason why he struggled with the script, is that, you know, he had this great visual motif with the pagoda, and he knew very well the story that he was telling with the ascension of the pagoda and the allegorical aspect of it, that almost anything beforehand, you know, would just pale in comparison. And, you know, he probably would have benefited, and I think he did at one point try to reach out to some people that could help him with the script. But it's funny because when I come back to it, I also have to, you know, we're incredibly privileged that we actually got to see this in its raw form the way it is. Because quite honestly, I don't think that if had Bruce lived, I don't think that we would have seen this particular footage. I think that we would have seen a Game of Death film, and it would have involved a pagoda, and it would have involved Bruce wearing the yellow tracksuit. But I don't think that, I think that, you know, by the time Enter the Dragon came out, if he had lived, the success of that, I think that, you know, he would have been Hollywood bound almost immediately. There were a lot of things that he didn't like about the Hong Kong film industry. There was a lot of things that he didn't like about working, you know, with Raymond Chow. So at that point, he pretty much would have had carte blanche to go and do what he did, you know, what anything that he wanted to do, but this time with Hollywood money, which was the goal that, you know, he was trying to achieve from the very beginning. So I almost feel that the Game of Death footage as is would have never seen the light of day. It would have just been a blueprint for what he would have gone and done with more money in Hollywood, you know. Of course, you know, I've argued, Matt Pauly and I have kind of gone back and forth a little bit about this, because he said, yeah, but, you know, he had to insure Kareem. I mean, Kareem wasn't insured when he shot that film. He kind of did it on the sly. So it may have been hard to get Kareem back to shoot that footage again, et cetera, et cetera. But again, when you're talking about Hollywood money, pays for everything, right? Or at least as much as what you want when you're in demand anyway. So, you know, it's interesting. I don't really know if Game of Death would have made it in that presentation. which is, again, we're lucky that we were able to see it in that sense, in the way it is. It still fascinates me to this day, the footage itself. And in fact, here's an exclusive for you. I'm actually still tinkering away at it as we speak, doing an entire remastering and upscaling of the footage that's not HD in it, because, as you know, it's a bit of a Frankenstein monster. I also want to do some more things with the war cries. I actually have gotten, one of the things that kind of bothered me was that I was a bit of a slave. Here's again another controversial statement to some of the hardcore fans. The war cries that I ended up using a lot of were from the 1978 film, which were voiced by Chris Kent. One of the questions that had come up, I think, from one of the people was, why did you not just keep, Bruce's own war cries? Again, war cries are an interesting topic when it comes to Bruce, because they're kind of something that he developed as a cinematic language. Nobody else had done that before him. And they almost, in a way, substitute for dialogue when it comes to him, because there's a whole range of emotions within those war cries. There's a lot of subtext that, they give you a range of emotions in terms of how he's feeling, so that there's kind of a cinematic language to it. And if you look at what Bruce was doing visually, his expressions in Game of Death, they were much more over the top than in any of his other films. He was doing a very specific thing. So matching war cries from his other movies was incredibly hard, and often doesn't work, because what he did in the other movies was not quite as extreme as what he was doing in Game of Death. So in that respect, I thought Chris Kent knocked it out of the park with what he did in the 1978 film. And I'm working with him now. He's come back and he's actually filling in the gaps for the things that, that didn't. So I'm actually replacing the war cries that are in existence now that come from Bruce's other films with Chris Kent to keep it consistent. No doubt a lot of fans are going to raise two eyebrows and say, how could you do that? Blah, 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 blah. Again, it's in the effort of good filmmaking, right? You don't just slap Bruce's war cries from his other films just as a bid to, be authentic and try to, force a round hole in a square peg. You have to do what is visually consistent for the film, So that was one of my battles when I was putting it together. So, I'm still knee deep in the Game of Death stuff with what I call the Redux 2.0 version.
Interesting. And do you have any hopes as to when 2.0 might become completed?
Completed. I'm still working on a few things. I'm hoping to have it done by the beginning of the year of 2021. So, and then it's just a matter of seeing, what form it's going to take in terms of getting it out to, getting it out there. I have a few things, burning with that. So we'll see, but I'm very, very, very excited about it. I also made a few artistic decisions that are a little bit different. This is one of those things where you kind of go down a rabbit hole, Daisuke. It really is, because it's like no piece of writing is ever done. No film is actually ever done to the person who's doing it. So I don't want to end up like, George Lucas 10 years from now trying to integrate CGI into Game of Death, because, I think it works better. But, I hope that this next version will kind of satisfy what it is that, that I think is kind of needs to be improved on. And I can let it breathe in a much better way than now, And again, that's not to substitute what's on Criterion. I'm still very proud of what's on Criterion. It's just, again, one of those things where, is the work ever really done? And look, honestly, I love Game of Death so much that, I'll always probably be thinking about it one way or the other.
That's well said, my friend. Well said. As you say, also, it's a Rubik's Cube of a puzzle, and there's so many, I'm sure, so many possibilities, and so many. One can think about it, and still have many more questions that lead to more questions, lead to more questions. So it's in and of itself its own pagoda, as it were. What's the end result?
Correct.
We're not sure, right? So, wow,
Yeah,
that's
I mean,
fascinating.
right. I think that, one of the things about it is that, um, for again the hardcore fans, that kind of take this stuff seriously. I mean, like, I kind of liken what I did with the footage almost to the JKD philosophy itself. Basically chiseling away at the unessentials, and allowing the truth to come out. Of course, when you do that, as Bruce Lee, was very well aware, it ruffles a lot of feathers because there are people that love to hang on to the classical mess. You know, so is that, the irony is almost too rich for my blood sometimes.
Well, that in any event, my friend, I want to say just best of luck with your endeavors with 2.0
Thank you,
and
sir.
with the world of Game of Death and with Bruce Lee. As I say, it's always fascinating to get uh, perspectives on this riddle, this conundrum that is the essence of Game of Death. And so I look forward to any further insight that you could have to offer and your own perspectives that you pick up going forward. I really do. So I want to thank you so much again for your time in giving us your approach and your approach to Bruce Lee and also to the film and to Redux. I once again, I want to thank you so much for this.
Daisuke, it's a pleasure speaking with you. Like I said, I'm a big fan of your work and your channel, and will continue to follow you. And I'm very appreciative of the opportunity to actually speak and discuss this with you. You've got great insights, and as I mentioned, it's just it's good to be talking to you about this with somebody who really appreciates not only Bruce Lee but cinema itself as an art form.
Oh, you're too kind, and not at all. And I'm I I do want to say that if not if when 2.0 is completed and if the circumstances and situations are okay, I would love to ask you to come back again, and hopefully we can continue this conversation and talk about the specifics of 2.0 and some of the reasoning behind any changes you have there. So would that be okay?
Oh, absolutely. It'd be my pleasure. I'm always happy to talk with you.
Oh, and oh, that would be splendid, absolutely splendid. So let's do that. And so with that, best of luck with 2.0. And if you have any other news or any other insights about Bruce Lee and the cinema, I look forward to talking with you then and maybe on other occasions as well. So let's do that. And I'd love to have you back and we can continue this conversation.
Thank you so much, Daisuke. This has been a real treat, and I had a lot of fun.
Thank you. And so once again, I just want to say, so Alan Canvan, thank you very much. And uh, again, once again, Alan Canvan's work, which is Game of Death Redux, can be found as a supplement to the film Game of Death, which is included as part of the package here, the Criterion Collection release called Bruce Lee, His Greatest Hits. It's a Blu-ray set. It is fantastic, and you can catch Game of Death Redux by Alan Canvan, who has very graciously given up some of his precious time to join us here today. So thank you very much, Alan. It was a great pleasure to talk with you.
My pleasure, Desuke. Thank you so much. And I'll talk to you soon.
Yes, we'll talk again soon, my friend. So cheers. Thank you.
Take care.